We also talked about doing a cranking vacuum test, 3 to 5 inches, to make sure we can safely crank the engine for what, 3 to 5 seconds. Actually, 3 to 5 is the reading, 10 seconds, 10 to 15 seconds, which means we'd have to disable ignition or something to make sure we can crank it normally. And then I told you to go look at that chapter over. This is going to be a simple one. If in fact our exhaust manifold, or if our exhaust is restricted, when we snap the throttle from idle to like 2,500 RPM, we would rapidly see the vacuum drop to almost nothing and kind of start bouncing, try to come back. Because normally if we don't, it will drop slightly and come right back. So do look those over. I don't know, maybe I already gave you one of the test questions. I don't know if I did. We talked about electronic fuel injection. The intermediary way of doing it would be to introduce throttle body, because it was just unbolt the carburetor, bolt this with the adjoining components. We didn't have to change manifold or anything, which was more economical for some manufacturers. But it still had the same problems inherently that a carburetor does, because we're bringing air and fuel together still. Has to be a metal, right? And remember that the metal, we had to compensate for cold start problems or cold running problems, because the fuel would want to stick to cold metal. So we had a group of components called EFE, right? The crossover tube, the heating stove plate, right? The butterfly that's on the exhaust manifold, all these different ways of trying to heat up the manifold or keep the bottom of where the carburetor is or where the throttle body is, to keep the fuel what? Atomized. Because the liquid droplet, we really can't take advantage of it. The gas form, atomized form, is what we want. Okay, and we talked about that we're going to be using a fuel pressure regulator. The fuel pressure regulator that's inside the throttle body works the same way as the external one. The only difference is that you don't have a diaphragm, because the whole inside of the throttle body assembly is already flooded with vacuum, because it's sitting on top of that motor. So it was easier to envision the vacuum. So with vacuum, it would have a lower pressure than without vacuum. Generally, there's a difference between what? Half a bar or 7 to 10 psi. Because we're not interested in raising pressure fluidly. We're incrementally doing it to make sure that we can keep an injector pulse width that's within the operating window and get the fuel in there. Open loop, we're using all our sensors and ignoring the O2 sensor. Closed loop, we're including now the O2 sensor of having a very high authority. Okay, and we talked about vacuum leaks and idle control, right? IF counts. And we talked about fuel pressure, right? System pressure